And thanks so much for coming today. Today is all about connection. If there's one point I want to get across today, it's what a lot of people already know, and that's everything is connected to everything else. And unfortunately, and often don't behave as if we believe that, and I want to show you why that's important for our reefs. So reef structure and fish abundance are connected, as I'll show you, but I'm going to show you threads connecting many, many different things over the course of this talk. So have you ever lived in an area for quite a while and then left for a long time and then come back and notice the changes? What happens is, or at least for me, is I notice changes that I may not have noticed because they occurred so gradually through time. I first lived in Hawaii 37 years ago, and after a few years left for the mainland where I had a long career, and then came back just several years ago, and I noticed two major changes up front. One was many fewer fish there used to be, which concerned me. The other was a good thing. Way less litter on the roads. 37 years ago, there was so much litter on the roads, it was just amazing. And I think the kids finally shamed their parents into making changes. So connections. The ancient Hawaiians did not have to be taught about connections. They knew that all things were connected. And changed their land and seascape, the Ahupua'a system. They knew that the connection started at the peak of the mountains all the way through the watershed out to the ocean with branching connections all the way through. Now it took Howleys a while to learn that for themselves. One of the first ones to articulate that is John Muir. John Muir was a naturalist who is best known for getting Yosemite National Park started, spending many years in the Sierra Nevada of California. In 1911, he wrote, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything in the universe." And that's true. A little while later, another well-known naturalist, Otto Leopold, came up with the idea of the importance of conserving those pieces that we take from nature. And he says, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So we're blessed in Hawaii with amazing coral reefs that provide many services for us. There's fish, food that we get from the reefs. The reefs act as natural breakwaters that keep our islands from eroding more rapidly into the ocean. And increasingly, we're finding that reef organisms, fairly humble things like sponges and sea squirts, are providing chemicals that fight diseases such as cancer. And who hasn't been touched by cancer directly or indirectly? So these are amazing resources that nature has given us. And the connections of coral reefs are just absolutely immense. And that's really what I want to focus on. So what I'm going to do today is first talk a little bit about the corals themselves, because their biology is part of this connection. Then we're going to look at some of the major threats facing coral reefs in Hawaii and elsewhere. And that's going to get kind of gloomy because there's some really dire things going on and some bad predictions. But then we're going to turn to reasons for hope. And reasons for hope have to do with things that we can do, all of us, to protect our reefs for the future, for the kids. So starting with reef building corals. Most of us, I'm assuming most of you have touched corals before and know a little bit about corals, but they're these hard structures that live in the oceans, made out of calcium carbonate. And if we look more closely, we see that the skeleton is covered by a thin veneer of life, little tiny polyps, as they're called, like little sea anemones that live clonally and secrete the calcium carbonate skeleton or limestone skeleton below them. As they grow up, they build the reef. So these are the key creatures of our reefs. And in fact, the Hawaiian genus starts with the birth of a single coral polyp, because that's what gave birth to all the life on our islands and the oceans. Now inside, if we look more closely at one of these polyps, you see this little tentacle sticking out. And if you notice all these little brown dots, those are actually single-celled plant-like organisms that live inside the coral. And they feed the coral, and the coral feed them. It's actually two species living together. It's a mutualism. And that's important to keep in mind because it's this mutualism that allows the corals to grow, and it's the breakdown of that mutualism that is great concern for the future, which I'll come back to. So the reefs grow up, and then they start interacting with the rest of the universe. And I want to bring the connections all the way back to what's called the carbon cycle. This is the most complex thing I'm going to put up today. But what's very important to keep in mind is how the things we do everywhere in the world affects our coral reefs. And I want to take it back to the beginning. So the carbon cycle is based primarily on a gas called carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide naturally occurs in the atmosphere, and plants take in the carbon dioxide in a process called photosynthesis and create plant material with that using the sun's energy. That's what feeds everything on this planet. The plants are then eaten by animals, animals eat other animals, and eventually the plants respire or breathe. So do the animals. Everything eventually dies and breaks down, and that respiration or decomposition releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that's a cycle that's been going on since the dawn of time, since life first evolved on this planet. Now it so happens that hundreds of millions of years ago, a whole bunch of plant life got buried. And so much of it got buried that it formed the ground, becoming what we call fossil fuels. And so what fossil fuels are land plants that have been compressed for so long that they've partially decomposed into what's called coal, and marine phytoplankton or single-celled plants that have been compressed so long that they've partially decomposed into what's called oil. So coal and oil are our main fossil fuels, they're called. They're called fossils because they came originally from plants. Now, if you think about all those fossil fuels being produced hundreds of millions of years ago, and I'll bring this back to reef soon, what happened was it's as if the Earth took a giant breath in. It held in all that carbon dioxide for hundreds of thousands of years. And now we're burning these fossil fuels to run our society, which is great, but we're breathing out all that carbon dioxide in an instant in time, just over the last 100 or so years. And that's causing problems on this planet. Now, it's often thought the atmosphere is so big, the oceans are so big, how can humans possibly affect them? Well, if we put that in the perspective of the whole planet, there's not that much stuff on this planet. This drop here represents all the water on planet Earth put into one drop. And this balloon represents the entire atmosphere put into one balloon. Can 7.5 billion people affect those two dots? Absolutely. If we look at the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere each year, 8.8 petagrams, and a petagram is a billion metric tons, which is hard to imagine. It's equivalent to a solid carbon Empire State Buildings, over 26,000 of them. And if we laid those end to end, they would extend from Scandinavia to Cape Town, as shown by the red line here, over 6,000 miles, or entirely across the Pacific Ocean from California to Japan. That's how much carbon gets atomized in the carbon dioxide and put into the atmosphere each and every year. It's a huge amount. So where's all that carbon go? How does it connect to the ocean and then to the reefs? Well, of that 8.8 petagrams, about a quarter to a third gets absorbed, carbon dioxide gets absorbed directly by the oceans. The gas just mixes in with the seawater. About another quarter to a third is taken up by growing plants. And thank goodness we have forests that are still growing. As the trees grow, they take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The rest stays in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so it leads to atmospheric warming. There's no doubt about that, it's happening. And as the atmosphere warms, it warms the oceans. And what about the carbon dioxide that gets dissolved directly in the ocean? Well, it mixes with seawater, carbon dioxide and water, and it forms a weak acid called carbonic acid. Same stuff that's in soda pop. I don't know if you remember, but I remember my mom saying, don't drink so much Coke because it'll rot your teeth, right? Your teeth are made out of calcium. That weak acid works on them. So that leads to what's called ocean acidification. So now let's bring all that back to our coral reefs. Ocean warming leads to a phenomenon called coral bleaching. Those little single-celled plants that live inside the coral polyp, that mutualism breaks down when the water becomes too warm. And this is happening increasingly around the world. The polyp then spits out those little single-celled plants, which is what gave them their color, so the coral then looks white or bleached. It's not really bleached, it's just lost its color because it's lost its symbionts. Now, Hawaii has been hit in the last 2 years pretty hard by coral bleaching as the ocean gets warmer. And we've been lucky so far because our reefs have recovered pretty much from those bleaching events. But it's not going away. It's going to continue to happen more and more till eventually the corals won't be able to recover. So I'm painting all the dark stuff now. We're going to get back to hope. Just bear with me. What about ocean acidification? Does it mean that the ocean becomes so acidic that if you run and jump in the ocean, you come out looking like the Joker? Well, no, that's not what ocean acidification means. It actually just means that the ocean is becoming less basic, if you remember your high school chemistry. That means is that we get this carbonic acid forming, and what that does is it prevents corals from building their calcium carbonate skeletons. It also inhibits the growth of any sea life that has calcium carbonate as part of its body. So what ocean acidification really means is less coral growth through time. And it affects a variety of things. In the upper corner here are corals. There's also seaweeds that have calcium carbonate. These are some single-celled organisms that have calcium carbonate skeleton. Sea stars, some crabs, all the mollusks, clams and their relatives, all have calcium carbonate skeletons. And one species or group of species that's very important is this pink stuff. Have you ever noticed that pink crust growing on reefs when you're out snorkeling or diving? Crustose coralline algae, and they're super important for our reefs because any corals, the little babies, the larvae, settle just on those crustose coralline algae. It's like their nursery habitat. And what we already know is that this crustose coralline algae, which is also made out of calcium carbonate, is going to be having trouble in future oceans. This is an experiment done out of Coconut Island here locally. Glass settling plates were grown in oceans of the present, where you can see these sort of pinkish dots, which is all those crustose coralline algae growing, and in the future when the ocean's more acidic. And what happens is the crustose coralline algae can't grow. Just this green scuzz grows. So we're going to be having less coral for two reasons. One, coral bleaching. Two, ocean acidification inhibiting coral growth. And there are some dire predictions out there. Now this is a mathematical model that tries to predict how much coral cover there's going to be in the future, starting with the present and then going through time. And what this model predicts is that by the middle of this century, very shallow coral reefs in Hawaii will disappear. It also predicts that by the end of the century, virtually all our reefs will disappear, those 20 meters deep and deeper. Very dire predictions. But I don't believe them. And a lot of people don't, because I believe that there's things we can do to help our reefs. And I also believe that nature does have an inherent capacity to resist such changes if we help nature. But we have to help. We can't just sit by. But the prospect we're now facing, if we do nothing, and if we continue with business as usual, is that reefs like this is a photograph taken here in Hawaii, will eventually degrade into something that looks like this. This is also a reef in Hawaii. This is in Maui. This particular reef was killed by runoff, siltation, which is a local stressor. But when reefs bleach and eventually die elsewhere in the world, they end up like this if we don't do something about it. When we lose all those services, all those fish, all those medicines, bad stuff. So what are the reasons for hope? Let's bring this up now. I've taken you down into a pit. Now I want to bring you back up because all is not lost, I guarantee it. First, Hawaii is in a sweet spot in the oceans. This map shows all the negative effects, ocean acidification, less oxygen in the oceans, decreased productivity of the oceans, predicted over the future. This was work done by Camilo Mora, who's a professor at Manoa. And if you look at the green arrow there on the left where Hawaii is, it's in this green zone, which means we're in a pretty good ocean here. It's not too warm. It's still reasonably productive, decent oxygenation. We're going to be one of the last places. Still have time to save our reefs. And then we get to my expertise, marine biology. A big reason for hope are what are called herbivores. These are fishes and sea urchins and other invertebrates that eat seaweed. Now, how does that save corals? Now, these fish happen to be eating seaweed or algae off the back of a turtle. But those yellow tang and those colae do the same thing on the reefs. They're the lawnmowers of the reef, and they're super important. Perhaps the most important of the herbivores are the parrotfish, or Ooohoo. I'm playing this loud because I want you to hear him biting the coral over the bubbles. Can you hear that? You hear those bites? What the parrotfish is doing is scraping seaweed off the surfaces of dead coral surfaces. So Ooohoo, it's all these guys, all the parrotfishes. General Hawaiian name is Ooohoo. This is incredibly important because where they scrape, those crustose coralline algae can grow and baby corals can settle. So these animals, the parrotfishes, the surgeonfishes, sea urchins, all these different herbivores, as they're called, seaweed eaters, they're the things that save the reef when the reef dies. If we have lots of herbivores and we get hit by a big ocean or coral bleaching event and the reef corals die, the herbivores will keep things clean so the corals can resettle and grow. If the herbivores are gone, seaweeds grow, and that's that, because the corals cannot grow where seaweeds have grown. So that's the main connection I want to make for you today, is the importance of these fish. And Ooohoo do even more than that. Not only do they reduce the abundance of seaweed and let more corals grow, but they also are our major sand producers on our reefs, because they scrape those dead coral surfaces and they literally poop sand. I had a good movie of that, but some people are too disgusted by it. A study was just completed in the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean, which showed that 80% of the sand on those islands is produced by parrotfish. 80%. It's long been underestimated, the importance of parrotfish for producing sand. And how many of you who've been here a while have noticed our beaches starting to disappear? Less sand out there by far. That was the biggest change I noticed when I came back from being absent for nearly 30 years, was the Ooohoo have disappeared from this island. So we get this nice positive feedback loop going on a healthy reef, where the more herbivores, Ooohoo, we have, the less seaweed and more corals we have, the corals grow and then provide food and shelter, places for these fish to hide from predators. And so we get what's called a positive feedback loop in science. That is a self-reinforcing loop that continues indefinitely unless it's disturbed. Now, if you want to get a little more technical, and this is where scientists like to draw arrows with thicknesses and plus and minus signs, the herbivores have a strong negative effect on seaweeds and keep the seaweeds under control. The seaweeds, which would otherwise inhibit corals, have a very weak effect. The corals grow up and provide food and shelter for the herbivores, and so have a beneficial effect on the herbivores. That's that positive feedback loop. And that's the way it was here 40 years ago when I was here. And what's changed is that there's been way too much fishing, especially around this island. And it's not all fishing. I'll point out the bad guys here in a minute. But if you have way too much fishing, that loop gets broken. The fishing reduces the abundance of the herbivores. Therefore, they cannot control the seaweeds anymore. The seaweeds can eventually overgrow the corals, especially if the corals have been bleached. You lose the corals. If you have a reef that's totally degraded like that one I showed you, the fish go away. Then it never comes back. It's stuck in a new phase, as the scientists call it. So what do we need to do? We need to save the Ooohoo. We need to save the Ooohoo and the other herbivores. Now, I'm not saying nobody can ever catch an Ooohoo. Ooohoo are very popular food fish. I'm talking about how much. So one big Ooohoo taken off a reef by an individual now and then is not a problem. That happened all through history and prehistory. The problem is this. Most of those are parrotfish. They were taken a single night by 6 guys with spear guns and scuba. Now what parrotfish do at night is they go to sleep. They essentially go into a hole and doze off. They're sitting ducks. So these guys actually have a name for this. It's a very common practice. They call it bombing a reef. We bombed that reef. Lights and shot the fish while they were sleeping, and we took them all. Way more than any one person needs. This is waste. This is not traditional fishing. Nobody can scream traditional fishing rights doing something like this. And the problem we have in this state and elsewhere is that this is not enforced. Fishing regulations are not severely enforced here. People do this all the time. They do it at my beach. Scuba and spearfishing do not go well together if you want to have fish on a reef. So it turns out that 63 nations around the world have realized this and banned some combination of scuba and spearfishing. Not the United States, not yet. 63 other nations have figured it out. We haven't figured it out yet. So my personal mission, having come back here several years ago and seen that we are setting ourselves up for destruction is to try to conserve parrotfishes and other herbivores on the reefs. Because if we do so, when our reefs get hit really hard by coral bleaching, they'll have a chance to come back. But right now, nothing's going to prevent seaweeds from taking over because there just aren't the herbivores out there. So part of this effort is an experiment that I'm doing here in Hanauma Bay, as well as off Waikiki. And it's an effort to show very clearly to politicians who don't like to do things unless they've been led by the nose sometimes, what happens when you have a reef that has a lot of herbivores versus a reef without those. And these are using these sort of artificial coral heads made out of concrete blocks that I've done work with before in the US Virgin Islands and the Bahamas. And as you can see there on the lower left, if one of these is left for a while with lots of holes in it, lots of fish settle and grow, sea urchins settle and grow, and you get a nice little reef growing, living coral, everything's happy. If you have no holes on one of these, not much happens. That's lower right there. Eventually you get a thin layer of scuzz and no corals ever settle and grow because those surfaces don't allow baby corals to grow. There's no herbivores there. So I want to show this to the legislature and others. So we're setting up this experiment in Hanauma Bay, where that black X is a deep sand flat area, about 60 feet deep. Very few divers go out there, and it's way too deep for most snorkelers. So these things will be sort of out of sight. We're setting up 3 that have lots of holes and 3 that don't. And our predictions are that the modules with lots of holes, which represents, to begin with, an intact reef that's just died. All the structure's still there, all the shelter's still there, but there's no living coral. That fish and invertebrates will be attracted. They'll keep the seaweeds under control, and eventually you'll have a nice little patch reef growing there. Exactly what we predict. Excuse me a moment. There we go. Exactly what we predict will happen if we have lots of herbivores after a bleaching event. The modules that have no holes represent or mimic a reef that has died and collapsed, where there's no more shelter. We expect few herbivores to settle, lots of seaweeds to grow, and very few corals to survive. That's what we want to demonstrate to the people of Hawaii very clearly. So let me summarize all this stuff, because I've given you lots of connections in lots of different areas. Don't try to read all this at once. Let's just go through it one piece at a time, following the arrow. First, the oceans are getting warmer because of all the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. There's no question about that. It's happening. And because of that, coral bleaching is happening more and more frequently. Hawaii is very vulnerable unless we have those herbivores in place. The oceans are acidifying, which means the corals are not going to be growing as fast as they used to. When corals are stressed by temperature or acidification, they also are prone to disease, which is something we must be aware of. Ocean storms are becoming more intense because of the warm ocean is a more energetic ocean. I've emphasized overfishing of herbivores. That's something we can definitely do about. And we need to be aware of silt and fertilizers and sewage getting into our ocean, which has often been a problem here in Hawaii. Notice that there are these global problems in the upper left and local problems in the lower left. The local problems, each and every one of us can do something about. But with all these stressors, the resilience of our reefs, the ability of our reefs to withstand these changes, to recover from these events, is lowered. And what that can lead to are dead reefs covered with seaweeds. But we can take local action. We can stop the overfishing of our herbivores. We can control the amount of runoff that runs onto our reefs and other local stressors so that our reefs are ready to withstand the changes that are forthcoming and survive. Hopefully, with other changes taking place globally with the amount of carbon emissions. This will increase the resilience of our reefs and hopefully prevent or at least delay the loss of these wonderful systems. So what each one of us can do is first to educate ourselves and others. Thank you again for being here. Support ocean conservation in a variety of ways. There are ocean conservation groups. The Nature Conservancy is very active here in Hawaii, Surfrider Foundation and others. Obviously, voting is important. Do we vote for the ocean and the climate? And of course, we all need to reduce our carbon emissions. Hawaii's way ahead of the game compared to all other states. But everything we do results in carbon emissions. The worst thing around, I hope I don't see any, is bottled water. Okay, bottled water weighs a huge amount and costs a lot to transport. But if we have our own little water bottles, which all you guys do, which is great, we don't have to concern ourselves as much with that source of pollution. And if you're truly interested in lowering your carbon footprint, there's a great little book put out by the Union of Concerned Scientists called Cooler Smarter, Practical Steps for Low Carbon Living. It's not that hard. It's not incompatible with a wonderful, productive economy. So I want to leave you with a couple quotes that are some of my favorites. One is that the ocean and what happens to the ocean, since the ocean is downstream from everything, is this quote by E.E. Cummings. For whatever we lose, like a you or a me, it's always ourselves we find in the sea, ourselves and our activities. And most importantly, this is about the kids. I just became a grandfather for the second time a couple weeks ago. This is about their generation, much more than my generation. And Terry Tempest Williams, I believe, says it all here. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped, that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come. So I thank you, but it's really the keiki. So thank you. Mahalo.
Do we have any questions?
So I went to the coral reef symposium that happened not too long ago, and I was listening to one talk, and there was a professor or someone talking about how if things keep on going, the reef will not die, and they will actually revert to from when they evolved and go back to the TLC, and go back to little small structures, not large, huge reefs. Also, fishes have changed with back to that. So I just, what is your opinion on that? Do you think if you don't do anything, things fun going?
If we don't do anything, then reefs as we presently know them will go away. There will still be things growing in the ocean. The large structures will go down, which means there'll be fewer fish, less productive fisheries. And we'll definitely lose quite a few species when that takes place, because a relatively simple ecosystem, low-lying ecosystem, just can't support as many species as a high three-dimensional system like a modern coral reef. So there will be winners and losers. There are species that are impervious to ocean acidification. There's been times in the ancient past, due to large volcanic eruptions, when basically all the calcified organisms in the sea went away for a while. And we just had things like bryozoan reefs, which are a whole different kind of reef. So there'll be life in the sea. I don't think we can extinguish life, but the question is whether we want what we have now to persist or just let it change into something else. Great question, thank you. Yes?
The experiment that you're conducting right now, when did it start and how long does it take to run the whole thing, and then when are you seeing the results?
That's a great question. We're just now getting started. We've only put a couple of the modules in off Waikiki. We haven't even started here yet. We have permits for the project to last 10 years, because what we're actually going to do is let it run for 5 years, and then we're going, as a further demonstration, we're going to switch treatments. That is, we're going to plug the holes in those reefs that have holes, and we're going to open up holes in those that don't. And we're going to see the benthos shift. And if that doesn't demonstrate to the legislature the importance of reef structure and herbivores, I don't think anything will. But that's our intention. This is just one aspect of the things we're trying. I have a graduate student who started a organization called the Ooohoo Conservancy. And they're just trying to get the word out, having concerts, and they're going to start making bumper stickers. So be watching for a bumper sticker that says, "Save the Ooohoo." And you can go, I know what that means.